Today's video is from the Knight and Rose podcast. There's no video, just audio, but it was kind of them to use names that I can easily render into a video format. So thank you, Wintry Night and Desert Rose. They are discussing alternative explanations for resurrection data. Their primary focus for why they think someone should believe the gospel is the very point that broke my faith in the gospel. Let's see why we have such different takes on this story. Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and channel members. If you heard me in the interview on the Utopians mention that some of the inspiration for the videos that I respond to comes from suggestions from viewers. One viewer that frequently sends me suggestions is Atheism Actually. This is one of his.
In our first episode, we talked about how to make a case for the resurrection of Jesus using only facts that have both strong evidential support and are granted by virtually all scholars on the subject matter. This includes non-Christians.
Cool. Sounds like they're taking the Gary Habermas minimal facts approach. If you haven't seen Paulogia's recent video, where in a Q&A with Mike Licona, they take a question from Paulogia, resulting in Habermas distancing himself from his own claims of his facts being from a majority of skeptical scholars, you really need to take a look at that. Will Knight and Rose stick to the few facts that really are agreed on by most scholars? Are they even aware that Habermas no longer claims that he counted the scholars that agree on these facts? Let's take a look, or rather, a listen. There's no video.
In that episode, we listed 6 minimal facts, and we talked about why the resurrection is the best explanation for those facts. In this episode, we're going to be looking at attempts by naturalists, so those who don't accept any supernatural events whatsoever, to provide an alternative explanation for those minimal facts.
Cool. Since Paulogia has presented a robust case, despite Mike Licona giving him a failing grade.
For Mike Licona, he was giving my minimal witnesses hypothesis a failing grade.
Give us a percentage. What is the percentage chance you think that holds water?
0.
In response to Gary Habermas's minimal facts, I hope they will cover Paulogia's response.
So in our first episode, we listed 6 criteria, or rather 6 facts, minimal facts. Mm-hmm. The first was that Jesus was killed by crucifixion. The second was that Jesus' disciples believed they saw Jesus resurrected from the dead. Mm-hmm. The third is that Paul, the enemy of Christ, who was Saul, became a follower of Jesus when he believed he saw the risen Jesus.
So far, so good. I'll keep this on the screen as they finish their facts.
Fourth, we talked about how James, the brother of Jesus, who was a skeptic, became a follower of Jesus when he believed he saw the risen Jesus. Fifth, we talked about the early proclamation of the resurrection in Jerusalem where the events occurred. That was within 1 to 2 years of the crucifixion, if not much sooner. Mm-hmm. And sixth was the transformation of the disciples from cowardly doubters to courageous apostles who were willing to sacrifice whatever it took to share their message.
So they are definitely using Gary Habermas's list. They made some minor alterations to that last one. We'll see if that becomes important.
Yes. So I noticed that in your presentations lately, you just try to do something in like 45 minutes. So you don't use all 6 of those. You're using a subset. So why don't you just give us the same material for our listeners who want to make a quick case, for these minimal facts? Which ones should they use if they have limited time?
I really like to use the acrostic CASE, C-A-S-E, to help me remember 4 facts that we can use to make the case just as powerfully as if we had 6 or 12 or 24 facts that have been discussed in various books.
Cool. They don't even need all of the 5 minimal facts to make a case for the resurrection. They can do it in 4. 4 minimal facts can establish a resurrection in their opinion. If there really were 6 or 12, as Gary used to have before the facts started dropping as more skeptical scholars didn't agree on the proposed facts, the case would have been stronger. But have no fear.
There's no need to fear. Underdog is here.
Rose can do it in 4.
The acrostic is the word case, C-A-S-E.
That's
And
so
this-
funny. In computer science, we call that a mnemonic.
Okay.
M-N-E-M-O-N-I-C. It's just like you
Right.
take the first letters of every word and then it helps you to remember
Right,
what it is.
exactly.
So,
Exactly.
Oh, brother. Knight needs to explain what a mnemonic is. Is their audience a bunch of high school kids?
Yeah, so the C in our case is crucifixion. Jesus was killed by crucifixion. Okay, virtually every historian on earth who studied the life and death of Jesus will agree that Jesus was killed by crucifixion.
Yep, the mythicists deny this one, but most historians agree that Jesus was crucified. Considering that this is a mundane event in first century Rome, this isn't a difficult thing to grant. How someone died provides no evidence of what happened to them after they died. Thus, it has no bearing on any claim of a resurrection. If it did, there would be tens of thousands of cases we would need to explore for possible resurrections.
Even if it is breached, it would take a number beyond reckoning, thousands.
Tens of thousands.
But, my lord, there is no such force.
right.
The A in our case is for appearances. Jesus' disciples believed that Jesus appeared to them, risen from the dead. Non-Christian scholars don't believe Jesus actually rose from the dead, but they do acknowledge that Jesus' disciples believed they saw him risen from the dead.
It doesn't have to be something like crazy glowing light or anything like that. I think Gary
Right.
Habermas says, you saw your friend die, you
Right.
went to his tomb, and then a few days later, you see him in the supermarket and go, hey, Gary, what are you doing here?
Right. Right.
So, but they believe that they saw him after he died. That's all.
Right.
That's all that everybody admits to.
That overstates what the scholars agree on. To use Knight's example, they had an experience that they thought was seeing a person in the grocery store. Not that they actually saw something in the grocery store, but they had an experience they thought was seeing the person. It might have been a bereavement hallucination. It might have been an illumination, as opposed to a hallucination. Here's Paul Agea's explanation of the difference, which he takes directly from Gary Habermas's book.
Gary's books define hallucination hypotheses and illumination hypotheses as two categories of naturalistic attempts to explain the disciples' belief that they saw the risen Jesus. For Gary, a hallucination hypothesis proposes that the disciples' appearances were false perceptions of sight, seeing something that isn't really there, where an illumination hypothesis suggests that Peter, and subsequently other disciples, had subjective experiences or insight that led them to believe in Jesus' resurrection. Gary's refutations of both hallucination and illumination in Volume 2 of the book lean heavily on his opinion that these notions cannot explain how groups of people saw risen Jesus. Unfortunately, he spends no time considering whether or not groups of people actually saw Jesus.
To put this in Knight's example, the person may have had an insight that they interpreted as having seen the real person. No appearance needed, not even a hallucination.
Yeah, and then the S in our case is for skeptics. Okay, and here I put Paul and James together under skeptics because Paul, who was an enemy of Christ, and James, the brother of Jesus, who was a skeptic, both became followers of Jesus after what they believed to be resurrection appearances.
Right. So this is important because I feel like a lot of people are thinking, well, Christianity, if it makes you feel good, if that gets you credibility with your family, then go on believing it. That's people are thinking it's a community thing. But for Paul, his community was
His community was decimated when he left his role as a Pharisee and started proclaiming the resurrected Christ.
Granted, that gets you to Paul had an experience he thought was genuine. It doesn't mean the experience really was genuine. The reports on what those experiences were don't even agree with each other. I would believe the account that was written by Paul himself over the ones in the book of Acts, which is evidence against the historical accuracy of the book of Acts.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he had his group of Jewish scholars that he was a part of
Right.
and very good with them.
Right.
And he wasn't just saying, I saw Jesus alive after his death. He wasn't saying that to just keep up with his group. It was an
Right.
experience he really believed. And
Right.
even though at the time he was an enemy of Christians. So.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
I'll grant you the popularity was not Paul's motivation. Whatever Paul did experience, he most likely believed it to be genuine, as what happened to him afterward wasn't always pleasant. On the other hand, if he had any idea of what would become of his writings, fame could definitely have been a motivator. If he really were in close communication with an almighty God who happened to also be omniscient, which he would have to be if he were inspired by said God to pen most of the New Testament, as many Christians believe, could this God not have also told Paul how important his writing would become? If so, this could be a motivator to fame. However, I don't think Paul had that kind of insight, and thus this was not Paul's reason for his conversion.
And then the E in our case is for early proclamation. So Jesus' resurrection, as we mentioned, was proclaimed very early on, very shortly after his crucifixion, beginning in Jerusalem again, where the events themselves took place.
How early is early? Are we talking a day, a year, 10 years, 50 years? 50 years would still be considered early when you consider how much time has passed since.
Right. And I think it's important to say that there was no historical background in Judaism that expected one single person to rise from the dead ahead of all of the righteous people getting resurrected at the end of the age. I think we're going to talk more
Right.
about that.
Oh, and we get no clue as to what they mean by early. Also, no support for this claim.
Why do historians agree with these minimal facts? What about these reports in particular work better to make it historically reliable as opposed to like a story like the guard at the tomb, which is in Matthew, which is kind of doubted by many?
There are several, but let me just list a few. So there's eyewitness testimony. Okay.
Eyewitness testimony? You don't have that for any of the minimal facts. If the Gospels were eyewitness testimony, you would have as much evidence for the guard at the tomb that you acknowledge scholars don't agree on as you would for the other minimal facts. Do you have an eyewitness account that we don't know about?
Right. So someone who is present at the events and reports what they saw is generally considered a stronger witness than someone who came along, say generations later or even just years later and said that something happened. So eyewitness testimony.
Granted, where are these eyewitness accounts you speak of?
We also have early testimony. Of course, testimony that is earlier, closer to the events themselves, is considered stronger than testimony that arises later.
That's it. You claim to have eyewitness testimony and you aren't even going to say what it is? Let me guess. You assumed the Gospels are eyewitness testimony, so you assume you have eyewitness testimony. If you are simply going to assume that the evidence exists, why not assume that God personally attested to the authenticity while you are at it?
Enemy testimony. If your enemies who don't like your message, don't like you, don't want what you have to say to be taken seriously, but they agree with you on a certain fact, then that lends tremendous strength and weight to that fact. So we have enemy testimony with regard to things like the empty tomb.
You do? Considering an empty tomb didn't even make Gary's minimal facts, and you have already acknowledged this by listing the facts, and this one isn't even there, why do you think the evidence for an empty tomb exists? The experts clearly aren't buying that such evidence exists. Do you have something that they don't? Or do you think the experts are unreasonable in denying what you see as clear, strong evidence for your claims?
Embarrassing testimony is the fourth one. So, for example, what the disciples record is themselves as weak and clueless.
Do they? Which disciples write this? Where is this writing? I'm guessing you're referring to the Gospels and you simply accept the traditional view on Gospel authorship, not bothering with the current scholarship.
They report that the women were the first witnesses to the empty tomb and the risen Christ while they were hiding out of fear for the Jews. So embarrassing testimony that doesn't make you look very good. It carries, of course, a certain strength with it. There's multiple attestation. So when something's reported by several people, it's considered stronger than something that's just reported by one person.
Unfortunately, all of these are based on the assumption that what is written in the Gospels happened. Since the whole point is to try to show that one event in the Gospels happened, the resurrection, it is begging the question to assume that all the other things written in the Gospels really happened in order to prove that this one thing written in the Gospels really happened. If we have to take it on faith that these other things happened, why not just admit that the reason you think that there was a resurrection is also a matter of faith?
Okay, those are very good criteria. Yeah, I can kind of see why people would be more inclined to accept something that was in multiple sources and one of them is early, or something that's reported by like an enemy of the church, or it's embarrassing to the authors.
Right. Yeah,
So,
these are pretty intuitive, and they don't just apply to the case that we're making here. These are historical
general.
criteria for reliability, in general.
Rose is right. There are criteria for determining historical accuracy of an account. However, if we have to take it on faith that there really were multiple sources, or that there really was eyewitness testimony, or that it was embarrassing, then you haven't established the criteria you are using. You simply asserted that these criteria are met. That which is asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence.
yeah, I could imagine going to like a criminal court case and you're trying to, defend your client, and then you're able to show that someone who is like jilted or harmed by your client says, "Oh, I don't like him at all, but he was definitely there,
Right.
at this place on the night of the crime, so it couldn't have been him." That would make a big difference.
Yes, that would make a big difference. But again, you don't have that for the Gospels. There is no eyewitness testimony of a resurrection. Thus far, you have claimed such testimony exists, but you have yet to identify who this testimony is supposed to be from and what this testimony is.
Right,
Okay.
exactly.
Do you want to talk about some of the evidences for those four things? Like, I think it's important for people to know what sources we're looking at, particularly when we have non-Christian sources for some of these. So why don't you start with
Yeah,
the crucifixion,
Cool, we get the sources.
and then
sure,
I'll go
yeah.
after. Yeah.
So for the crucifixion, for example, we have ancient non-Christian sources. These include people like Josephus, Mara bar Serapion, Cornelius Tacitus, Lucian of Samosata. These are all very, very early. We've got the Jewish Talmud, which was a slightly later source, but based on earlier sources. So these are all ancient non-Christian sources attesting to the crucifixion of Jesus
Yeah.
and his death by crucifixion.
I'll grant you these. Jesus died by crucifixion. These have nothing to do with the resurrection. Many people were crucified in first century Rome. Jesus was too.
Bart Ehrman,
Oh, no.
who's devoted his life to trying to disprove Christianity. Gerd Ludemann, Paula Fredrickson, virtually all New Testament historians are all going to agree that Jesus was killed by crucifixion because the data is very, very strong.
Yeah, it's ironic. Those first three names right there, Crossan, Ehrman, and Ludemann, all three of them have debated William Lane Craig denying the resurrection. But when it comes to the crucifixion, they go, "Oh, no, that definitely happened because look at all the evidence,
Right,
for it."
exactly.
Of course, because there is evidence for a crucifixion, but not a resurrection. Your incredulity is misplaced. If you were at a murder trial and the defense admitted that his client was at the scene where the murder took place, he isn't denying it because there are multiple sources of evidence that he was there. But the defense still denies that he is the guilty party, as there is no evidence that he is the one that did the deed. And there were several other people there as well. This would not surprise you at all. Since it is mundane to admit to facts that are established and to deny those that are not, why your incredulity at famous skeptics admitting to the established history, but denying the Christian claims that are not supported by the historical evidence?
So what about the appearances? The appearances are also really popular with skeptical scholars. They don't
They
want to
are.
deny it.
What do you mean by the appearances are popular with skeptical scholars and they don't even want to deny it? Even Gary Habermas doesn't include group appearances as a minimal fact in his book. This doesn't speak to all appearances, but just to group appearances. But in the interview, he contradicts his book.
So, are the group appearances part of the minimal facts? And do skeptical, non-believing New Testament scholars grant them?
They are definitely part of the minimal facts.
They are not. To review, here's Gary's list of facts, taken directly from page 149 in Volume 1.
1. Jesus died due to the effects of Roman crucifixion. 2. The disciples afterwards reported experiences that they thought were actually appearances of the risen Jesus. 3. These experiences accounted for the disciples' lives becoming thoroughly transformed, even to the point of being willing to die for their belief. 4. The proclamation of Jesus' resurrection and appearances took place very early, soon after the experiences themselves. 5. James, the brother of Jesus and a skeptic before his conversion, most likely believed after he also thought that he saw the risen Jesus. 6. Just a few years later, Saul of Tarsus, Paul, also became a Christian believer due to an experience that he also concluded was an appearance of the risen Jesus to him.
There's nothing in here about group appearances. Number 2 is worded very carefully. Disciples reported experiences they thought were actually appearances. The statement carefully avoids how many of the disciples said this. I say it's just 1, maybe 2 if I'm feeling generous. And it avoids putting any kind of qualifier on the nature of these experiences. If you start adding qualifiers like bodily or group or visual, Gary would no longer be expressing something that the majority of scholars consider to be a fact. Group appearances are not a minimal fact, Gary, and you know it. But you're gonna do a dance here to pretend you're good.
Again, this does not address the point as to all appearances, only as to group appearances.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Knight and Rose have yet to support their claim. If they do, I'll get more specific with regards to the scholars they claim support them on this point.
There's kind of a two-pronged case here. First, that the disciples claimed they saw the risen Jesus.
Mhm.
And secondly, that the disciples actually believed they saw the risen Jesus. So there are at least 9 independent sources claiming that the disciples claimed to have seen the resurrected Jesus. These include Paul's letters to the Christian churches.
Mhm.
These include oral traditions like early creeds and sermon summaries.
Mhm.
An example of an early creed, of course, would be 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7.
Mhm. We talked about that extensively in that
we
first
did.
episode.
Yes.
It's a gold mine.
Absolutely.
I can almost tell, like I sometimes, I can judge like how serious a Christian is if I say to them, which part of the New Testament do you think has the most weight with skeptics? If they know it's 1 Corinthians 15, then you know somebody studied these issues.
Somebody's been reading, right, and studying.
I don't know, Revelation.
This creed has the most weight with skeptics? No, it doesn't. Skeptics agree that this creed existed at the time that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, and that is dated as being one of the first books of the New Testament to be written. The creed in chapter 15 had to exist prior to the book, as Paul reports it as being a creed. 1 Corinthians was written about 20 years after Jesus died. When was the creed composed? We don't really know. When were the events reported in the creed, particularly the appearance, supposed to have taken place? We don't know. Sometime after Jesus died and before 50 CE, when 1 Corinthians was written. By historical standards, that can be considered early. The problem with this creed for skeptical scholars is we can't put the events anywhere in history. It gives us no dates or locations to look for such an event for an appearance to more than 500, or to Peter, or to the 12. It lacks the data necessary to have historical relevance.
We also have, of course, all 4 Gospels attesting that the disciples saw the risen Jesus. We've got Clement, who was a disciple of Peter.
Finally, something to work with. We don't know who wrote the Gospels, when, or based on what evidence, so they hold little weight for evidence of a resurrection. The claim that Clement supports the claim as a disciple of Peter is the first piece of evidence we've been given that wasn't. Here is the only writing we have of Clement of Rome. Bart Ehrman says to call the letter 1 Clement is a misnomer, as the letter referred to as 2 Clement was written by someone else. The primary purpose of the letter is to chide the Corinthians into unity. It deals with the issues that arose resulting from a change in leadership. Was Clement a disciple of Peter? It's possible. They lived in the same time period. But the letter gives no such indication. There is this reference here to apostolic authority, but nowhere is Peter singled out as the mentor of or authority for Clement. In the entire letter, Peter is referred to only twice, first acknowledging his labor and death, and then in quotation of what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 1:12. If Clement were a disciple of Peter, one would expect more reference to him. The letter also at no time claims Peter or anyone else to have been witness to a resurrection. The closest you come is these two references to a resurrection. Clearly, Clement believed in a resurrection, but nothing in what he wrote makes a claim that anyone he knew saw a resurrected Jesus. The work has only even a few mentions of Jesus. The slides here on the screen are the only references to Jesus in the entire letter. It is a long letter, but it talks very little about Jesus. This site says Clement believed as Paul did, which is well supported by the letter. Paul never mentions Jesus having a bodily resurrection. He says he saw Jesus, but he does not say it was any physical body. By Paul's words, he was not even sure it was real. It could have been a vision. So Rose's claim that Clement, a disciple of Peter, supports there having been witnesses to a resurrection is incorrect.
Polycarp, who was a disciple of John.
This is a more common claim and has been dealt with more thoroughly by biblical scholars. According to Stephen Carlson, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Religion and Critical Inquiry at the Australian Catholic University, none of Papias' writings exist. We have quotations from them from Eusebius, Apollonius of Laodicea, and Andrew of Caesarea. Out of all that has survived of his work, it is his statements on the writing of Matthew and Mark that have attracted the most attention. None of these indicate that Papias claimed to have been a disciple of John, or to have heard a first-hand account of a resurrection. Bart Ehrman, in his book Jesus Before the Gospels, sets out his case as to why he does not think that he was. Ehrman says, Irenaeus, in around the year 180 CE, claimed that Papias was a companion of the disciple of Jesus, John the son of Zebedee. But Eusebius, who actually read Papias' book, claims that this is incorrect. Based on what Papias himself said, Eusebius points out that Papias was not a follower of any of the apostles. He got his information from others. In other words, Irenaeus was trying to make Papias out to be more of an authority than he was. That is very much the tendency in the early Christian tradition and among conservative Christian scholars today, to claim direct connections to eyewitnesses when there weren't any.
9 independent sources that the disciples claimed to have seen the resurrected Jesus. But then we also have 7 independent sources claiming that the disciples really believed it, which was evidenced by the fact that they were willing to suffer and even willing to die for what they were claiming.
Yeah.
So several different sources on that. For example, there's we've got the testimony of Luke, writing around 62 AD. We've got the testimony of Clement of Rome in the 1st century, Polycarp, Ignatius, Dionysius of Corinth, Tertullian, Origen. So these are very early, very strong, reliable sources.
I'll grant Rose that the disciples really believed it. Were they all willing to die for this? There is no evidence for this for some of the disciples. I'll grant her Peter, Paul, and James. If she wants to claim any others died for their faith, she needs evidence to support that claim. I'm not going to bother with these, as Rose has not either. She throws out names and claims that these support her position, but she provides no quotes as to what these people are supposed to have said that support her point. The claim about Luke, however, I need no quote from, as that is well known, at least to me. However, we don't know who wrote this account and based on what data. The claims of an unknown person using unknown sources is not evidence of anything other than that the author believed this. I'll grant that the author of Luke believed that Jesus was resurrected. Luke doesn't write anything about anyone dying for their faith, except Stephen, who wasn't an apostle, and there is no indication that he ever saw a risen Jesus.
Excellent. Okay, what about the Assin case for skeptics?
Right. So we've got evidence that Paul actually became a Christian and that he believed his message in the fact that he was willing to suffer and die for it. So evidence for Paul's conversion includes his own testimony, Luke's record of Paul's testimony, which of course is found in Acts.
Let's look at that. What Paul says happened at this conversion and what the author of Acts says happened are quite different. The author of Acts doesn't even agree with himself as to what happened. There are 3 accounts of Paul's conversion in Acts. They're in chapters 9, 22, and 26. In chapter 9, suddenly a great light shone around Paul. He heard a voice say, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Those with Paul stood speechless. They heard the sound but didn't see anything. The version in chapter 2 adds more detail to what the voice said, but here the companions see the light but do not hear the voice. They then take Paul to Damascus, where he receives his sight back, and Paul goes to Jerusalem. In chapter 26, the bright light shines all around Paul and his companions, and they all fall down. He goes to Damascus and then to Jerusalem. There's no mention of what the companions saw or heard. In the Acts accounts, all of them have Paul going to Jerusalem shortly after his conversion. Paul, however, in Galatians 1, recounts the story, and he specifically says that he did not go to Jerusalem. Rather, he goes to Arabia and then back to Damascus, and 3 years later, he then goes to Jerusalem. He says he didn't get his teaching from men, but from his visions. Acts 9, however, has Paul conferring with the disciples shortly after his conversion.
1 and 2, because
Yes.
this is where Paul goes to the early church leaders. I think it's
Yes.
Peter and James, and he says, "Hey, I'm preaching a message over here because I had an appearance of the Lord. You guys are preaching a message because you've had appearances of the Lord. Are we preaching the same message?" And they go, "Oh
Right.
yeah, your message is the same as our message, and congratulations on becoming one of the group that you were formerly hunting."
Yes. Exactly.
I absolutely agree with Knight here. Check out what Galatians 1 and 2 report about Paul's conversion. Paul returns to Jerusalem after 14 years of preaching to ask if he is preaching the same message as they are, and they confirm that he is, and he can go on preaching. But in Acts 9, Paul is conferring with the apostles very shortly after his conversion. Barnabas convinces the others that Paul is one of them. One of these authors must be wrong. My money is on the Acts author being wrong. It's more likely that Paul knew his own life better than the author of Acts.
And just don't stand so close to me.
Right.
That's something that everybody has to explain, right? I think
Yes.
everybody, no matter what, Hindu, Buddhist, whatever, is how did this prominent person who everybody knew and was talking about, Paul, really high up, very famous, very wealthy, high status, why would you switch sides? That would be like, switching from the football team that is doing the best in the standings to the football team that's doing the worst.
You think Christianity was the worst available religion available at Paul's conversion? Interesting. I disagree that everyone in every religion has a duty to examine this conversion story and come up with a reason why it happened. We don't do that for any of the converts to any other religion. Why for this one? Moreover, it was studying the conversion of Paul that was the point that broke my faith. I didn't look at Paul and think that if he converted, there must be something to this. Why would I? Don't get me wrong, Paul was an educated man and one of great influence in his day, but that doesn't mean his visions were in any way based in reality. More likely, he felt guilty about the way that Stephen died, and he had a hallucination based on that experience. Very like the PTSD experienced by soldiers after killing people, particularly civilians. Paul probably had a change of heart when he realized that he was hurting people, and he sought a more peaceful way of life, more in line with his worldview. The vision resulted from his change of heart, not his change of heart from the vision. This is just a theory, and I cannot support this, so take it or leave it as my opinion. When I reflected on Paul's conversion, I ended up at the divine hiddenness problem. If God can appear to Paul, why not to everyone? If he can't do that, he isn't omnipotent. If he can, but doesn't want to, he isn't all-loving, and he certainly cannot say that he wants all to know him. Regardless of which way you go, the God of Christianity cannot be who the Bible claims him to be. I'm skipping over all the people they list from the Bible that convert and may or may not have been martyred. We've heard this all before. Let's get to the alternative explanations. The actual topic of the video?
Is E for early proclamation?
Right. So we've already mentioned this. 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7 is
Yeah.
believed by skeptics, non-Christians, Christians, virtually anyone who's studied this. It's believed to go back to within 1 to 3 years of the events themselves. And many say even earlier, right up to the events themselves. And so
Oops, I guess we had one more letter to cover before we get to the topic of the video. This is a weird claim. First, those skeptical scholars do agree that the First Corinthians Creed was circulating early from a historical standpoint. They do not agree that it was within 1 to 3 years of the alleged events, as Rose claims. Bart Ehrman dates 1 Corinthians, where we find the Creed, to 50 to 54 CE. The Creed would have to predate that, but by how much we cannot know. Wikipedia says the consensus of scholars is 53 to 54 CE, citing Robert Wall as the source. Take that for what it's worth. Rose cites no sources for her claims. Rather, she makes this naked assertion and then builds on it as if it had a foundation. But what she builds on makes no sense at all. If she were right, immediately after Jesus rose, people would be gathering to worship and reciting this creed. That what? Came down from heaven? That someone made up on seeing a risen Jesus and called all their friends on his cell phone so it could reach them from whatever appearance to the 500 was supposed to take place to Paul's ears shortly after his conversion? How does this work, Rose? Since you made up the evidence, at least be kind enough to make up a backstory for it that we can all be amazed at.
1 Corinthians 15:3, I delivered to you what I also received. This denotes the imparting of oral tradition. Verses 3 through 5 appear to be Aramaic in origin. That was the original language of the disciples, and so presumably goes back quite far. The content of the text is stylized, and it contains parallelism as in a creed. And then the language is very non-Pauline. It indicates Paul did not write it. He was reporting something, as he was claiming to. He was reporting something that had been passed on to him.
Let's look at what Paul passed on. Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, except that is not according to the Scriptures. Not only is there no Old Testament reference here, there is no Scripture in the Old Testament that says that a Messiah would die for the people's sins, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. And again, there are no Old Testament prophecies that this is fulfilling. Christians point to Isaiah 53 as prophecy of Jesus' suffering and death. But even this says nothing about the Messiah being raised. It does say that he was assigned a grave with the wicked, which sounds more like he was buried with other crucifixion victims, not in a rich man's tomb. However, it also says he was with the rich in his death. Maybe he was buried with a rich, wicked man? Either way, the gospel account doesn't match up with the prophecy. The Jews were not looking for a dying and rising Messiah because there were no prophecies about a dying and rising Messiah in the Old Testament. If the Creed gets wrong the falsifiable claims about the prophecies in the Old Testament, why should we trust it about the unfalsifiable claims regarding resurrection appearances? Regardless of how soon after the alleged resurrection events this is supposed to have been written, we have no reason to think the events it claims happened really happened.
Is survey the best naturalistic explanations for what happened that squares with all this data. So the first one we want to look at is one called swoon theory. And it's not like, oh my goodness, it's Thomas Sowell swoon. It's not that. It's what they mean is that Jesus fainted or lost consciousness rather than died on the cross.
No reputable scholar has held this view since 1835. I'll skip this one.
He fails to explain the appearances to Jesus, for which there is abundant evidence. That's a big problem.
Why doesn't this count as explaining the appearances?
Yeah, so that is not a decent explanation because crucified men who are on the verge of death are not easily confused with resurrected men who came back to life. That the disciples were not expecting that.
Okay, I said I was going to skip this one, but Rose's answers to it are so silly, I changed my mind. Crucified men don't look like resurrected men? Really? How many crucified men have you seen, Rose? How many recently resurrected men have you seen? Do you have any photos of crucified men or recently resurrected men to which we can make this comparison? I have heard excusagists make both the claims that a resurrected Jesus would have looked just like he did after he was crucified, and that he would have looked completely healthy, other than the gaping wounds in his hand and his side, big enough for Thomas to put his fingers in. Artists have depicted a resurrected Jesus, a resurrected Lazarus, too, as we have no idea what such things would look like. We have nothing but our imaginations to go on.
It doesn't make any sense. So consider this. Okay, after Jesus' death, he was bound in linen
Really? What historical records would that be? Let me guess. The Bible. You consider the Bible to be a historical record?
According to the historical records,
Uh-huh.
his body was embalmed.
That depends entirely on which version of the storybook you read. At this point, I need to thank Rose for pointing out another contradiction in the resurrection narrative that I had never noticed before. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Joseph of Arimathea takes the body, wraps it in cloth, and he puts it in his tomb. There is no mention of any spices. On Resurrection Day, Mark and Luke both say the women were bringing spices to the tomb to prepare Jesus' body. Matthew doesn't mention any spices anywhere in his account. Luke is clear that the women prepared the spices after Jesus died, but rested on the Sabbath and didn't come to use the spices until Resurrection Day. John, on the other hand, has Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus putting 75 pounds of spices into the burial cloth, and the two of them do the preparation. There is no mention of any women doing anything with any spices. I'm sure the excusagist response would be that the women didn't know that the men had already done the spices, and so they prepared them as well. However, 3 of the Gospels have the women present with the body as it is put into the tomb. They should have known the spices had been applied. If nothing else, they should have been able to smell them. Thank you, Rose, for giving us one more reason to think that the resurrection stories in the Gospels cannot possibly be accurate historical accounts, as they do not agree with each other as to what happened. They don't even agree with each other as to why the women were going to the tomb on the morning of Resurrection Day.
In 75 pounds of spices, he was placed in a cold tomb blocked by a massive stone that we're told was too heavy for even a strong, healthy man.
That's not in any of the storybook accounts. The closest you get is the women asking who will move the stone. You've seen pictures of stones in front of tombs, yes, but are these historical depictions or artists' rendering based on the stories? I'm guessing artists, as according to this article, 900 first century tombs have been found intact, and only 4 had stones in front, and the 4 were associated with royalty. Considering there is no historical record that Joseph of Arimathea was royalty, there isn't even any record of Joseph of Arimathea existing at all, it is unlikely that his tomb would have had a stone to cover it. And that Jesus has some kind of claim to royalty also doesn't fit because the tomb supposedly was needed in a hurry, and they would have taken Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, not one that had previously been prepared for royalty.
Right, so a second theory that we want to talk about today is called the substitution theory, which holds that it wasn't Jesus who was hung on the cross, it was somebody else who was substituted for him.
This one is only popular among Muslim scholars. Since I'm not interested in how Muslims address Christianity, I'll skip this one. Probably.
And some people actually believe this, so what's wrong with this theory?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, for one thing, there are no records whatsoever of anybody claiming that it was anybody but Jesus. And that seems like it would have come up if that was even a possibility. People sometimes mention a twin brother. Well, there's no mention of any sort of twin brother during the birth narratives of Jesus or his childhood or anything else. But this theory is actually primarily believed by Muslims who believe that Allah made it look like Jesus was crucified when really it was someone else. Some Muslims will say that it was Judas who was crucified in some act of poetic justice for his betrayal of the Messiah. I've heard others say that it was Simon of Cyrene who carried Jesus' cross, right, and then was crucified in Jesus' place. Oops, you know, can you imagine? Like that makes me kind of cringe and laugh at the same time. Like you're carrying Jesus' crossbeam, and the next thing you know, you're nailed to the cross. You're like, I was just trying to help.
Yeah, well, that would actually deny the first minimal fact, because the first minimal fact is Jesus is the one who was crucified.
Right,
and that's
exactly.
what's universally agreed by all historians. So is there any non-Muslim historian that denies the crucifixion of Jesus?
And once again, I said I was skipping this one, but this is a point worth mentioning. Knight makes the claim that Jesus having been crucified is universally agreed upon by all historians. He then asks Rose if there are any non-Muslim historians who hold to this theory. Does Knight think that Muslim historians are not historians? How do Muslim historians not get included in what is universally agreed on by all historians? Might want to rethink the phrasing there, buddy.
Not that I'm aware. No,
Yeah.
no. I mean, there have been some people who were steeped in Gnosticism over the years, but they're not really taken seriously.
And now Rose makes the same category error with Gnostics. She says that she is not aware of any non Muslim historians who hold to this view, except the Gnostics. How did the Gnostics manage to fall out of humanity as to get excluded when talking about all universally agreeing that Jesus died by crucifixion? Incidentally, Rose left out another group, the mythicists. They also don't think that Jesus died by crucifixion because they don't think that Jesus ever existed. Dr. Richard Carrier is a first century historian and a mythicist. How is he also failing to make the cut of all historians? Seems your claims of universality fall a few screws short of a hardware store.
If the disciples invented this and they just rolled the stone away, grabbed the body, stashed it somewhere, and then said, hey, we've all seen postmortem appearances of Jesus, I could think immediately of some problems with that. But what are some of the problems you see with that?
This is more commonly the theory that the disciples stole the body.
Well, again, this does fail to explain the post-mortem appearances of Jesus or
The people like Paul and James, right?
Oh, come on. They could have propped up a body at a table and claimed to have been eating with him. Or, more likely, if they stole the body, they just make up stories about how there were appearances. After all, the alleged appearances are from sources they claim originate with the disciples. If the disciples stole the body to fool people into thinking that Jesus had resurrected, why not also make up stories about appearances?
Yeah, exactly. And yes, exactly. And yes, exactly. Most importantly, it fails to explain the skeptics becoming Christians.
Yeah, they're not going to go along with that.
How so? The disciples clearly decided they believed in this religion before they stole the body. I think they mean the disciples would not then die for what they knew was a lie. But first, we don't know that many of them even did. And second, we don't know that they didn't recant, but were killed anyway, as the Romans' problem with them wasn't theological, but political. Either way, I don't hold to this, nor do I know of anyone that does, so I don't see any reason to go into it in depth. At this point, I have another 4 pages of script written, but they're starting to get into some points that are really interesting. I don't want to make this too long so that it becomes tedious, nor do I want to hurry through the more robust points. So let's stop here and pick up next week with part 2. A lot of times when I do a 2-parter, the second part doesn't get as many views, but trust me on this. Part 2 is actually better than part 1. See you next week. Live your life.